All right, so this is going to be section 2 of Star Defender. So the next thing we are going to do is we want to get it so our enemies can start moving around a little bit. So we're going to have to set up a couple of things for that. So the first thing we're going to do is if you go to your event sheet, we are going to make a global variable called enemy movement. And basically, the enemy is going to have like several moving patterns. So we're going to have this variable track which movement pattern they're in, and then we can use that to guide it to the next pattern. So I'm just going to right click down here in the open spot. I'm going to say add global variable. We are going to call it enemy movement. And it can just equal 0. Okay, so that's good right there. Then what we have to do is we have to give the enemy a behavior. So if you click on your game layout, you can click on any enemy, it's fine. When you do a behavior, it'll do it to all of them. So I'm just gonna scroll down, get the blue behavior button here. They already have turret, but we're gonna add another behavior called custom movement. So you can type that in if you need to, or I guess in the newest version of Construct, they just call it custom, but they used to call it custom movement. All right, so we have the custom movement behavior. All right, and so then we can close that window out. We're going to go back to our ES game, and we're going to start to add some events for the movement, okay? Now, we haven't set up any groups yet, but we'll do that eventually. So for now, we're just going to add the event at the bottom, so you can just click Add Event. And basically what we want to do is every 3 seconds, we're going to have the enemy do a different movement pattern. So we're going to do System. We're going to do every X seconds. We're going to say 3. Okay, so there's my event every 3 seconds. Um, And then what we're going to do is we are going to make some sub events to this. So we're going to right click and I'm going to add a sub event. And we want to do system compare variable. Okay, and basically we want to make sure you pick enemy movement here, not enemies. So enemy movement, okay? And then we want to say enemy movement is equal to 0. Done. Okay. Um, and then basically what we're going to do is we are going to add an action to that. And so when the enemy's movement equals 0, um, we are going to basically have the enemy, we're going to set the speed to a certain value, and we're going to tell it which direction to move. So we're going to add an action here. We're going to do enemy, okay? And we're going to do set speed. So if you just type in speed, now once again, there's going to be multiple speeds on here. Okay, so we want to make sure we do speed under the custom section. So this set speed with the wrench next to it, that's the one that you want. Okay, and that's going to want to know which direction. So we're going to say we want the horizontal speed, and we want the horizontal speed to be 50. Okay, so if enemy movement equals 0, we're going to set horizontal speed to 50. Okay, then what we're going to do is we are going to have it wait 2 seconds, and then we're going to switch to a different movement pattern. So I'm going to add another action. We're going to do system wait, and we're going to wait 2 seconds. So type 2 in here, click done. And we're going to have it stop movement. So we're going to add an action for the enemy, and we're going to type in stop. And we want the stop with the wrench because we want to stop the custom movement. So I'm going to say stop. Okay. Then we are going to change the enemy movement variable to 1, and we're going to set up a new pattern for 1. So I'm going to add an action. We are going to do system. We're going to set value. So we're going to set the value of enemy movement to 1. Okay. So basically right now, every 3 seconds, it's going to do one of these movement patterns based on the number it is. So we've only set it up if the value is 0. So basically what we want to do is we are going to have 3 more movement patterns. So what I'm going to do is we're going to copy this entire event 3 more times. So what I would do is right here where my cursor is, you can see where it's circled here in this empty area. You're going to right click right there. We are going to copy. You're going to right click there again, and you're going to paste. Right click again, paste, right click again, paste. So you should see 4 of them total, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to edit these other ones. So we're going to say enemy movement equals 1 for this one. This one's going to be enemy movement equals 2. and this one's going to be enemy movement equals 3. So basically, when we initially created that enemy movement variable, we're just creating a way to basically identify like several movement patterns that we can create. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to do some quick little edits. So on enemy movement equals 1, instead of horizontal speed to 50, we're going to change it to vertical speed to 15. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this from horizontal to vertical, and we're going to change the speed to 15. So 1, 5. Okay. And then when we're finished with the enemy 1 movement, we're going to set the enemy movement variable to 2. So there's two things we're editing. Okay, so you change this speed here, vertical to 15, and then this you're changing enemy movement to 2. Okay, now when it's 2, we're going to change the horizontal speed to negative 50. This is going to make the ship move left instead of right. So yeah, I should clarify that really quick. So here's what the movement is doing. So this is going to be the default value that they start at. When we say move horizontal speed 50, it means they're going to move to the right. And their rate is like 50 pixels per minute or per second or whatever. Okay, so they're going to move to the right at a rate of 50. Okay, then the enemy movement gets switched to 1 and we change the vertical speed to 15. So that means at a rate of 15, they're going to move downwards. So positive 15 is moving down. So basically, you're going to move to the right a little bit for a couple seconds, and they're going to move down. Okay, now when enemy movement becomes 2, we're setting it to negative 50. So now they're going to move left the same amount they originally moved to the right. So it's basically going to put them back in their original position. Okay. Then when enemy movement 2 finishes, we have to change this here. This enemy movement here needs to now go to 3 so that it will basically go to the next section here, which is 3. So basically we're creating a pattern. It jumps from 0 to 1 to 2 and then to 3. When enemy movement hits 3, we want it to move down again. So we're going to change this to vertical 15. Okay, like that. Then down here, so we don't have an enemy movement 4. So what we do is when 3 finishes, we want to loop it back to 0. So here I'm going to set enemy movement back to 0. Okay. So the way that it works is the enemy starts at 0, they move to the right. They do that they wait 2 seconds, they stop, then they go to 1. So then they'll execute what 1 says. It says move down. So they're going to move down a little bit. Then that's going to execute and finish. Then it's going to go to 2. 2 is going to say now move to the left. So then all the ships are going to move to the left. Then it's going to go to 3. And then they're going to move down again. And then it says go back to 0, which is going to make them move to the right again. So this is basically a never-ending cycle, and the enemies are just going to be moving around over and over and over again. Okay, and we can test it really quick and see if it actually is working. And it's just wanting to take time to load, but it should be working at this time because we have the behavior. Yep, and so there they are, and we'll just watch. And you see they move to the right for a little bit, then they go to 1, which moves them down. Then they go to enemy movement 2, which is left. Then they go enemy movement 3, which is down. And then they reset back to 0, which is right. So there's your never-ending pattern, and they're just going to keep moving like that over and over and over again. So if you program that incorrectly, it should be moving around just like I showed you there. Okay. If not, just review the code really quick and make sure that this looks right. But basically, that's what it should look like right there. Okay. All right. Next, what we're going to do is to make sure in case we like restart the game or something, we want to make sure that this global variable starts at 0 all the time. Because like I could be in the middle of a game and that enemy movement could be at 3 and I could die. Well, when I restart, that enemy movement would start at 3 and then the enemies would move incorrectly at the beginning of the next game. So on start of layout here, we have to add an action and we're going to do system set value. And we want that enemy movement to be 0 to start. Okay. This is just going to make sure that there's no funny business with that variable being different. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to get into spawning the enemies ourselves rather than just putting them all on here. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to delete every enemy except for 1. So I just like if you just kind of pick a spot out here, you can click and drag a big rectangle over them and delete a bunch at one time. You don't want to delete them all. You just want to get rid of all of them except for 1. Okay, and then what we're going to do is since we're going to spawn it in later, we want it to be off screen. So we're just going to put off screen. So the bullets and the enemies, since we're going to spawn them in manually, we're going to put them all off screen. So just like that. Okay. All right. So now we need some new global variables. So let's go back to our event sheet. We're going to right click down in the open spot. We're going to add a global variable. We're going to make one called new enemies. And we'll put it like this, enemies. Okay, new enemies, and we're going to set it to 27 initially. So we're going to start with 27 enemies on the screen. Okay. Um, so this is going to track how many new enemies that we'll have right away. Okay. So this variable is going to be the trigger on how many enemies we actually are spawning. The other thing we're going to do is we need to track for all the enemies, we have to track their X and Y position. So we're going to make a global variable for each. So I'm going to right click and add another global variable. I'm going to call this one X position. Okay. And the default value is going to be 75 because basically the first ship is going to start out at the coordinate 75, 75. And so that's going to be our default for X and Y is 75 to start. So X position at 75, and then we're going to make another one for Y position. So I'm going to right click, add a global variable called Y position. And then that is also going to be 75 to start. Okay, perfect. So it should look like this. We just made new enemies at 27, X position at 75, and Y position at 75. Okay. All right. On start, what we're going to do now is we're actually going to set the enemies variable to 0 instead of 27. The reason why is now we're not starting with 27 enemies on the screen. We're actually going to start with 0. So we want this variable to start at 0. And then what's going to happen is the enemies are going to spawn in through our code. And we're going to make it so that each time an enemy spawns, it'll add one to the variable for us. So the game's going to automatically track the enemies. We're not going to tell it how many we have to start because I might want to change this and have less than 27 at the start. And so then that way the code will automatically adjust to that by the way that we code it. Okay. All right. Now, on start, we're going to make a sub event to this. So you're going to right click on the green arrow, add sub event. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a repeat event that will create the enemies. So we're going to do system, repeat, and we're going to want it to repeat new enemies times. So you're going to type in new, and your new enemies variable should pop up and you want to double click it. So basically this event here that is going to create our enemy ships, it's going to repeat however many times this variable is at. So right now it's going to repeat 27 times. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an action to it and we're going to do system create object. So we're going to create an enemy. So we're going to click and choose enemy. Okay. Um, The layer for now can be 0 because we haven't really done anything with layers yet. But for the X and Y coordinate that we created at, we're actually going to create it at the X and Y position variables. So for X, type in X position, and for Y, we're going to do the Y position. The reason why we're doing this through the variables, because you might say, well, why don't we just spawn it at 75, 75 if that's where we want it? Well, the issue is we're going to be spawning 27 enemies. So if we just say 75, 75, it's going to spawn 27 of them right on top of each other. And what we're going to do is by using the variables, we can make the variable change each time a new enemy spawns so that it'll basically, we're going to make it create a row of enemies. So hopefully this will make sense once we get it in. So we're going to create it at X position, Y position. So each time one's created, we need to add one to the enemy variable. So we're going to add an action, um, system, add to, enemies, one. Okay, so we're going to add one to enemies. So remember on start, we set it to 0, and then each time one spawns, now it's going to add one to it. Now, if this confuses you up here, we have the default value at 27. Technically, the default value now is 0 because on start, we're just setting it to 0. So if it makes more sense to you, you could take this enemies and just put it at 0. I mean, it really doesn't matter what number this is because our on start of layout is always going to override it and set it to 0. But if it makes you feel better, because technically we do want the variable to start at 0, you could change the default up here to 0. Okay. All right. So we have that. We're going to add one to enemies. Then what we're going to do is each time one spawns, we're going to increase the X position variable so that the next one will spawn at a different location. So I'm going to add an action. I'm going to do system, add to, and we're going to add to the X position, and we're going to add 120. So basically what's going to happen is every time we spawn an enemy, the next one is going to be 120 pixels to the right of that one because we're adding 120 to the X position variable. And since we're telling it to spawn at X position, this number is going to keep adjusting as new enemies spawn. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we have this add turret target player. Now the problem is we can't keep this on start anymore because what'll happen is there's not really going to be any enemies on the screen. It's going to say add turret target player, and then we're going to spawn in a bunch more. These new ones that spawned in don't have the command of add turret target player. So we're going to move this down to here so that as each enemy spawns, they will add the target right away. Okay. And then the stop animation will move down there as well. So basically, we just took those top two on start events, we moved them right down here into this repeat new enemies times. Okay. All right. Then what we're going to do is the way that this is set up is every time an enemy spawns, it's adding 120 to X position. So if we just look at this here, right? So if I just hover my mouse, roughly, it'll be somewhere like around here is 75, 75. So the first enemy is going to spawn here, right? So then it repeats, it adds 120 to X position. So what's going to happen is it's going to move over 120, then the next one's going to spawn, then it's going to move over 120, next one's going to spawn. The problem is that the way that I currently have it set up is, let's say I have 100 enemies, right? It's going to keep moving over 120, 120, 120. And what's going to happen eventually, it's going to get here and it's going to just keep spawning them off screen. So what we have to do is we have to set a limit that once it reaches a certain spot here, that it's going to move down and start a new row below it so that it doesn't just keep spawning them off to the right. Okay. And my layout is 1200. Like if I put my cursor here, the X coordinate is around 1200-ish pixels. So I need to get to a point before 1200 where I need to tell it to stop and move down and start spawning in the next row. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a sub event to this. So you're right clicking on this green curved arrow right here, add sub event. This is on the repeat new enemies times. We're making a sub event. We're going to say if the X position reaches a certain spot, we're going to do a reset. So we're going to do system, compare variable. We're going to say if the X position is greater than or equal to 1150, because 1150 should still be within our window, right? Because it's about 1200 wide. Um, or it's actually 1280 wide, so 1150 is definitely within that range. So we're going to say if the X position is greater than or equal to 1150, we're going to reset the X to 75. So it's going to push it way back to the left again. So I'm going to add an action for system, set value, and we're going to set that X position back to 75, 75, okay, like that. Then what we're going to do um, is we are going to actually add to the Y position so that it will move down to the next row. So I'm going to add an action system. I'm going to say add to Y position, and we're going to add 65 to the Y position. Okay. So basically, the routine is going to be this. It's going. So let's say this is 27, right? New enemies is 27, so it's going to repeat and spawn 27 enemies. But each time it spawns, it's adding 120 to X position. So that's moving to the right, basically creating a row. Then, if the X position becomes greater than 1150, instead of adding to X position, we reset it to 75. So it's going to be way back to the far left. We add 65 to Y, which moves it down a little bit. So essentially, we're starting a new row. And then it'll repeat the same cycle up here again and keep moving to the right and finish that row. And then when that second row hits 1150, then it will reset. So what I can do is I can test this really quick because I think this should work. Yep, and you can see I've got three really nice rows here that are nicely spaced out because all of that code is telling the X and Y positions to grow at a certain rate and basically create the locations perfectly. So if you loaded yours and it looked like mine, you're good to go. The big thing here is the sub eventing has to be important. So anytime your code looks correct, but it's not working, it's usually sub-eventing. So your on start should be here. The new enemy should be indented into that one time because it's a sub-event of the on start, and the X position should be sub-evented into the new enemies and should be indented again. So see how it's outer and then inner again. So make sure the sub-eventing is correct, otherwise it'll kind of make it not work. Okay. All right, a couple more events. Um, what we're going to do is on start, we're going to add a couple more actions, and we want to make sure, once again, when we start a new game, um, we don't, like, if we die and the X and Y positions are at weird variable values, we want to make sure that these are always resetting to 75. So I'm going to add an action for system, set value, and we want X position to be 75. Once again, this is on my on start of layout event. Okay, so right here I just put it. And then we're going to do another one for Y position. Add action, system, set value. And we're going to do Y position, and we're going to do 75. Okay, there we go. All right, so we've got all those nice values started there. Okay, now what we're going to do is you'll notice when I run this, all the enemies look the same, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a global variable called enemy type to track which type of enemy they are. And then based on the type, we're going to do the different frames so that we can see the different enemy types, and we might even be able to make them shoot differently later and act differently. So we're going to add another global variable here. So go ahead at the bottom, just right click down here, add global variable, and this one's going to be called enemy type. Enemy type, oh, all one word. Okay, enemy type. And it can just be equal to 0 is fine. Okay, so you should have an enemy type variable at the top. Okay, all right. Um, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go into this repeat new enemies times, and we are going to actually make some new events to give them a certain type. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to add an action right here, right below the stop animation here, and we're going to do system add to, um, or sorry, set frame, my back. Sorry. Let me go back a step. Cancel that out. All right. Sorry, I'm getting a step ahead of myself. So what we have to do is when the enemy is created, we're adding an action that's going to set the animation frame to match the enemy type variable. So I'm going to add an action for the enemy, and we're going to set the frame. So you do set frame, and we're going to make it match the enemy type variable we just created. So it's enemy type. Okay, so by default, our enemy type equals 0. So if I look at our enemy, it's going to give it this frame right here. And then what we're going to do is every time we start a new row, we're going to add 1 to the enemy type, and then that's going to change the frame to this. So second row is going to look like this. And then when the third row starts, it's going to look like this. Okay. So this X position greater than 1150, this is when we trigger a new row. So I'm going to add an action to that, and I'm going to do system add to, and we're going to do enemy type, and we're going to add 1 to it. So now this is saying every time we add a new row, we're going to add 1 to the enemy type. Okay. Now the issue is if we get more than 3 rows, we don't have an enemy type. We don't have a fourth enemy type. So basically, we're going to make it loop back to the original one. Okay. So what we're going to do is we need to put a sub event on this 1150 event right here. So you're going to right click right here in the open spot. We're going to add a sub event. And we're going to say if the enemy type is greater than 2. So we're going to do system compare variable. And if the enemy type is greater than 2, basically we're going to reset it back to 0. Okay, so it should look like this. And then we're going to add an action. We're going to do system set value, and we're going to set enemy type back to 0. Okay. So basically what's going to happen is anytime we start a new row, we add 1 to the enemy type, which will give us a different frame number. So basically it's going to loop through all, so this is row 1, row 2, and row 3. And then basically if the enemy type would go up to 3, we reset it back to 0. And so the fourth row should loop back to this, fifth row would be this, and sixth row would be this. We can test it really quick. So if I run the game, There it is. First row, second row, third row. If you want to see what the next rows do, change your new enemies variable. Let's make it 52 really quick. Okay, so if I make new enemies 52, this first event now is going to repeat 52 times. So let's run it really quick. And you'll see it extends out. But you see row 1, row 2, row 3, and then row 4 reset the 0. And then it just keeps looping that pattern. Okay, so that was just for testing. So we'll put this back to 27. But you can see it's very easy to just test things out. So hopefully yours did what mine did. If not, you're going to have to review this code. And if you don't want to like look through the scan through the video to find the code to see if you did it right, I do have sample code on Google Classroom. Just look at that. It's in the instructions. You can look at the finished code and make sure you did it right. Okay. All right. So we're done there. Now what we're going to do is we need to add an instance variable on the enemy that the variable is going to track individually for each enemy what type they are, because then based on the type, we're going to make them maybe do different behaviors for shooting. So what we're going to do is go ahead and click on your enemy here on the right side. Just click it one time. And then on the left, we're going to add an instance variable right here. Okay, and the instance variable is going to be called type, T-Y-P-E. Okay, and it's going to equal 0. Okay, and that's all we have to do. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go back up to this repeat new enemy times event. And basically we're going to add another action to it right here. Okay, and we're going to do enemy, and we're going to do set value. So let's just type in value. And we're going to basically set the type to match enemy type. So all we're doing is when the enemy is assigned this enemy type variable, remember we're setting the frame to match it. All we're doing is we're making the instance variable match it as well. The purpose of an instance variable is that each individual enemy, that variable is tied to just that enemy, so it adds uniquely to them, whereas the global variable is applying to all of them as a whole. So basically all we're doing is when the enemies are spawning really fast, they're each getting assigned their own enemy type variable so that we know which type each enemy is individually. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make them have some different shooting behaviors. So we're going to go to this enemy on shoot event that we have here, and we're going to make sub events based on which type they are. So I'm going to add, right click and add a sub event, and I'm going to do enemy compare variable. We are going to compare instance variable, and we're going to say if the type equals 0. Okay, so it should look like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add an action for the enemy, and we're going to change the rate of fire. So you're going to type in rate, and we're going to do set rate of fire right here. And we're going to make the rate of fire 8. So that means they'll shoot once every 8 seconds. Okay. Um, then what we're going to do is um, we need to add, because we're going to have them actually have a different bullet frame as well. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to go to the enemy bullet, and we have to add 2 more frames onto this. Okay. So what we're going to do is if you want to just right click down here and add a frame, and right click down here and add a frame again. So all I did was just, I might have went fast here. I double clicked on the enemy bullet. So you just go to enemy bullet here on the right, double click it. Okay, and then I right clicked in the animation frame window and I added 2 frames. So then I'm going to go to frame 1 and I'm going to load an image. And in your folder, and sorry, I've got to find mine again really quick. So I'm going to go into, let's see, mine is under desktop, and then here, and then intermediate game design, and I need Star Defender assets. Sorry, that took me a minute. Okay, so now in here, you should have different enemy bullets. So we're going to add enemy bullet 2, and then I've got in this frame, I can click on this frame here and add another one, and then I should have the third enemy bullet here. Okay, so I've got 3 bullets here. Now what they've been doing in the code is they leave the animation speed on, and then in the code they just have you stop animation. For me personally, I just like to set the animation speed to 0. Because if the animation speed is 0, then this won't animate. So then it saves us some code, right? Okay, so then what we're going to do is we are going to, so if you do the presentation here, they have you add an action for enemy bullet, and then they have you do stop animation. Okay. So animation stop. So they have you do this. If you change the animation speed to 0, you do not need to have this. So it's up to you. I'm just going to do both just so I have it, but that's basically what I've got there. Okay. So if the type equals 0, where basically it's going to be the default bullet and it's going to do that. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this whole thing and we're going to do one for the other types. So I'm going to right click here and I'm going to copy and I'm going to right click here and I'm going to paste. And then I'm going to right click here and I'm going to paste again. And so now I have 3 of them. And so this is going to be type equals 1. So I'm just going to edit that to 1. And this is going to be if enemy type equals 2. Okay. All right. Then what I'm going to do is if type equals 1, um, and I just want to make sure I have, oh, you know what? I got a couple things that I missed on this one. Sorry. Um, so up here, there's a couple actions I missed. So we have to add an action for enemy bullet, and we have to set the speed because it's going to have its own speed. And we're going to do bullet speed. So pick the speed with the bullet on it, and we're going to set that to 250. Okay. And then we also need to set the frame to match the enemy type. So I'm going to add an action for the enemy bullet. We're going to set frame, and it's going to match enemy dot type. So we want to do enemy dot type because we actually want to refer to the instance variable. So it should be like that, enemy dot type. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete these out. And then now that I added these 2 events, it's going to be easier to just copy and paste again. So that's my bad. So get these 4 events in, then we'll copy and paste. So now we'll copy and then we'll paste 2 times, paste, paste. All right, there we go. Now we have the proper setup. So now it's just a matter of doing some quick editing, right? So what we're going to say is here is type is going to equal 1. Okay. And then we're going to do rate of fire to 6. So it's going to shoot a little bit faster. And we're going to do bullet speed here to 300. So the bullets are going to move a little bit faster. So we're making that enemy type shoot a little bit faster and the bullets move faster. And then this one, we're going to do type equals 2. Okay. And then we're going to do rate of fire to 4. And we're going to do bullet speed to 200. So this one, we're going to make the bullets actually move a little bit slower, but they're shooting faster. So this just adds some variety. So now if I run it, the enemy's bullets should look different. Yep, they all look different, and they're all kind of moving at different speeds. And then now when the next shot comes out, you'll see that one shoots and then that one shoots. So they're all kind of doing their own different rates, and it just adds some variety to it. Okay. So that's all in there. By the way, we've done quite a bit, so make sure you're just periodically clicking save. So I'm just going to save quick to make sure that we've got that all going. Okay. Then what we're going to do is remember on our game layout, we have like this one stray enemy off screen. So we need to make sure we destroy him right away on start of layout. So go to your on start of layout. We're going to add an action and we're going to do enemy destroy. Okay, like that. Now, this is a really common mistake that people make. So our new waves that we're going to be creating, our waves are always triggered on when the enemy variable equals 0. Okay. The problem is that when we destroy this enemy, we're going to be subtracting 1 from the enemy variable. So what happens is we'll set enemies to 0, then this one gets destroyed, and it sets our variable to -1. And so then when the next wave starts up, you actually end up having 1 enemy left on the screen, and the wave after that triggers right away, and it messes things up. So it's really important that we move this to the top. So we're going to destroy the enemy first. The enemy's variable will go to -1, but then right away we're setting it to 0, and then everything's good to go. So just make sure that this enemy destroy is at the very, very top. All right, so we're about halfway through. I know this is kind of a longer one, but once again, I don't expect you to get through these in one sitting. Just pause it, write down what time you're at in between videos, and then just jump right back in the next time you work on it, okay? All right, so now what we're going to do is we are going to organize our event sheet, and we're going to basically make a bunch of groups. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click down here. Whoops, down here. We're going to add a group, and we're going to make a group called start so that we have one for our start events. Okay. We're going to right click and make another group, and we're going to call this one user input. That's going to be like our controls. Okay, we're gonna click and make another group. We're gonna call this one enemy movement. Sorry, I got a cord getting in my way when I'm trying to type here. Okay, enemy movement. We're gonna make one called enemy shoot. Add group. So we're gonna call this one called enemy shoot. Okay, so that's gonna be the shooting code. And then we're gonna make a bullet collisions group. So we're gonna add another group called bullet collisions. All right. So now what we're gonna do is we are going to start organizing this stuff. Okay. So what we're gonna do is let's get the start events first. So this on start of layout event, you're going to grab that and we're going to drag that down into the start group. So that's going to go here. Okay, and then we can start minimizing things as we put them in. Okay, it's going to make things a little bit easier. So this enemy movement thing, this 3 seconds here, let's put this in the enemy movement group because that's where that belongs. Okay, perfect. And I'm going to minimize it so it's easier to see everything. Okay. Then what we've got a keyboard event, right? So this is going to be user input because we're telling it what to do. So let's take that keyboard event and put that in user input. And then here's another one on enter press. Let's also put that in user input. Okay, so now we got a couple things in there. We have bullet collision groups. So let's put this player bullet on collision with enemy. Let's put that in the bullet collisions group. And let's take this enemy bullet on collision with player. Let's put that in the bullet collision group. Okay. The order of these doesn't really matter. So if you want to make it the same as mine, that's fine. But if not, we're all good. Okay. And then this on shoot event, this is going to go in the enemy shoot group. Okay. Let's see. That should be in there. Perfect. All right. So if you did that all correctly, and you minimize it all, it should look like this. And I do like the order of these events right here. So you should just have 5 nice groups with everything dragged in and moved around really nicely. Okay. So if you open it up, your start should have the on start event with the repeat new enemies times. User input should have 2 keyboard events. Enemy movement should have the every 3 second with all the sub events. Okay. The enemy shoot should have the on turret shoot with all the sub events. And then the bullet collision should have 2 bullet collision events here. Okay, so now we've got things nice and organized very quickly, right? Very good. All right, so now what we're going to do is we are going to set up a wave system. So we are going to make a global variable. So right click, add global variable. We're going to call it wave. And it can equal, we want to actually equal 1. So our wave is going to start at 1. Okay. And then let's make a group for our wave system while we're in the mode of making groups, right? So let's add another group. And let's go ahead and call it wave system. Okay, so got a wave system group at the bottom. Okay. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is we have to add a function. So basically what a function is, it's going to be like an event that will have code underneath it as a sub event. And basically the function, all that code that is grouped underneath the function, it's something that is repeatable. So what we do is we call the function later on, and then it'll just execute all that code. So basically functions are good when you have big chunks of code that you want to like reuse over and over again, but you don't want to type out all the code. So basically it's a way to label or give a name to a group of code. And then you can just refer to that group of code by the name. So to make a function, we have to right click on the group name. So we're going to right click on the wave group and we're going to do add and then function right here, add function. Okay, then you have to name the function. So we're going to name it start wave. So basically, this is going to be a function that begins each wave. And there are several times in our code where we need to start the wave. So we don't want to have to like repeat all that wave code. So we're just going to call the function instead. Okay, so we're going to click OK. So now we have on function start wave. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to grab some actions, and I want to say they are from, yes, they are from the start group here. And what we're going to do is we are going to take the enemy movement to 0 and the X and Y position to 75. So you're going to hold control and highlight all 3 of those. And instead of those happening on start of layout, we actually want them to happen on start wave. So we're going to drag these down and we're going to put them in as the action on the start wave. Okay. Okay. And then what we're going to do is on start wave, we want the repeat new enemies time event to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the green arrow on this repeat new enemies times, grab it by the green arrow, and we're going to put that as a sub event of the start wave, just like this. So if you do that, it should be indented inward like this. So now basically what happens is anytime we call this function, it's going to reset these variables to their default, and then it's going to spawn enemies based on what the new enemies variable is. Okay. So then what we do is on start, instead of putting all the stuff in the on start, now up here we just call the start wave, right? So we're going to add an action, and now functions will appear up here since we've created a function. So we're going to do function, and then basically we're going to call the start wave. So you just double click on start wave and it will call it. Okay. So now essentially on start of layout, it's going to call the start wave. So it's going to go down here. And when it calls the start wave, it just executes all of this. So now it's very easy. Anytime I want to spawn enemies, I just call start wave and all of this will execute. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that when we defeat all the enemies in a wave, um, that it will call the next wave out. So what we're going to do is we need to make an enemy on destroyed event. Okay. And I think we're going to put it in bullet collisions because that's kind of where this stuff is happening. So let's go to bullet collisions and we're going to add an event to bullet collisions and we're going to do enemy and we're going to do on destroyed. Okay. Because right here we have player bullet on collision. So here we destroy the enemy, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to say on destroyed. We want to subtract one from enemies when it gets destroyed, not when the bullet hits. So I'm going to take this subtract one from enemies and we're going to throw that down here instead. Okay. And then what we're going to do is when the enemy is destroyed, we basically want to say when the enemies equals 0, we want to call the start wave. So on this enemy on destroyed, I'm going to right click and make a sub event. So let's add a sub event. And we're going to do system compare variable. And basically enemies equals 0 is what we want to check for. Okay. So now if an enemy is destroyed and we subtract one from enemies, and then if that enemies becomes 0, then basically we want to call the start wave. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an action, we're going to do function, and we're going to call the start wave. Okay. Um, and then what we're going to do, I just want to double check one thing really quick here. Oh yeah, okay. So a couple of other things we want to do when enemies equals 0 is we want to deactivate the movement group so that the enemies aren't just like trying to move when they're really don't exist. So we're going to add an action here. We're going to do system. We're going to do set group active. And we want to get the enemy movement group to be deactive. So I'm just going to type a quotation mark over this. And there's my enemy movement group, and we're going to deactivate it. Okay. Then what we're going to do is we're going to do a wait 3 seconds. So we're going to add action, system, wait. Let's see here, wait. There we go. And we're just going to wait 3 seconds. And basically what we want is we want these two to happen first, and then we call the start wave after the 3 seconds. So I'm going to take the start wave and just throw that at the bottom. So basically now what our event says, when we destroy an enemy, we subtract one from enemies. If that enemy number equals 0, we deactivate the group, wait 3 seconds, and then we call the start wave so that we get the next group going. Okay. All right. And I think that should be good. The other thing is if you have, I don't think I put it in mine, but if you have like a restart layout here on any of this, because I think earlier if you were doing like the regular presentation, um, I think like when we destroyed the enemies, that there was like a restart layout, but we're calling. So if you have anything that restarts the layout, just get rid of that. But in my videos, like I don't have it, so we obviously didn't do it. But if you followed the presentation, there was a part where they had you put a restart layout. So just make sure it's somewhere in this code. If you have a restart layout, just take that out because now we're actually adding waves in instead of restarting. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to this on start wave here. And we're going to open that up so we can see everything. All right. So on start wave, we're going to do a couple things here. So since we deactivated the enemy group there, we need to reactivate it on start wave. So I'm going to add an action here, system set group active right here, enemy movement. We want to make it active. Okay. And then let's see here. We've got all that. Oh, and then we have to go back up to here. Okay. So we've got this, we've got this, we've got this. Then what happens is after the enemies get destroyed and we call the start wave, we do need to add one to wave. So we're going to do system, add to wave one. Okay. And we have to add 5 to new enemies. Add action, system, add to new enemies, 5. Okay. So what's going to happen is it's going to increase our wave each time, and it's going to increase this new enemies variable. So remember, the new enemies variable tells us how many enemies spawn. So if it starts at 27, we finish the wave, then the new enemies is going to go up to 32. So the next time we have a regular enemy wave, we'll have 32 instead of 27. So this is kind of like making our game more difficult. Okay. Now, um, we want to put a limit because if we don't put a limit on the new enemies, like it could get up to like 75 or 100 enemies, and it would literally fill up the entire screen. And then at some point, they would spawn like on top of your ship. So we do have to put a limit to what new enemies can get to. So we're going to add a sub event to the enemies as 0 event right here. So right click that. We're going to add a sub event to that. And basically, if the new enemies is ever greater than 54, we're just going to set it to 54. We're going to make 54 our limit. So we're going to do system, compare variable, new enemies greater than 54. Okay, then we are going to set new enemies to 54. So I'm going to add an action, system, set value, new enemies to 54. Okay, so it should look like that. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we are going to add a blank sub event to this enemies equals 0. So we're going to right click. We're going to add a blank sub event. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to move the call start wave down here. So we're going to put that down here at the bottom like that. Okay. So that way, this will happen. This will all happen after the 3 seconds. It'll add one to wave. It'll do the 5 new enemies. It'll do this if that triggers, and then it will always call the start wave. So this is how this event series should look here. Okay, we're almost done with this section. All right. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to make it so the enemy fire rates will gradually increase to add some more difficulty. Because what's going to happen is if we get it to this point that the player has hit this 54 limit, it's never going to add more enemies than that, right? So the way we have to make it more difficult from that point is we have to increase fire rate because you can't just leave your game stagnant where like if a player is able to master the highest difficulty, then the game's just going to go on forever. So you have to basically make the game progressively get harder and harder to the point where if the player's good enough, you have to make the game get difficult enough that's basically impossible. There has to be some point that no matter how good the player is, that they get destroyed and the game ends. So we're going to continuously increase the fire rate. So we're going to add a global variable. So if you just go down to the bottom, right click, add a global variable. It's going to be called enemy fire rate. This can all be one word. It's like that. And we'll have the enemy fire rate equal 1. Now, the reason why the number is so small is we're actually going to use this as a multiplier to factor into their actual fire rate. So we're going to start it at 1, which means that it'll just be the default fire rate. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to this new enemies is greater than 54 event. And so basically at this point, anytime it's greater than 54, we're setting the new enemies to 54, but then we're going to add 1 to the fire rate. So at this point, instead of adding more enemies, we just increase the fire rate. So we're going to add an action, system, add to, enemy fire rate 1. Okay, so the enemy fire rate's going to get a new multiplier, or it's going to add on to the multiplier every time we basically cap out on enemies and we finish the wave. Okay. All right. So now we're going to go back up to a previous event we have, and I want to say it's going to be like event 15. 14. Okay, so on the type equals 0 event, so this is the enemy on turn shoot, and we have the enemy type equals 0, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to, in these fire rates here, instead of this being just a flat number, we're going to change these fire rates to incorporate that variable that we had. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to change the fire rate here. So instead of 8, it's going to be 7, and we're going to do plus. So plus. Okay, and then in parentheses, we're going to do 2 divided by enemy fire rate. Okay. So enemy fire rate by default is 1. So this is going to take 2 divided by 1, which is 2, and it's going to be 7 plus 2. So the new fire rate's going to be um, 9 here. Okay. But now what'll happen is that fire rate eventually is going to increase, and it's going to like significantly change how this acts from level to level. Okay, so on the second one, where type equals 1, we're going to change this from 6, and we're going to do 5 plus, and then we're going to do 2 divided by enemy fire rate again. Okay, like that. Okay, so that's how that one should work. And then the next one is just going to be 3. So we're going to go down here to type equals 2, and we're going to do 3 plus, and then 2 divided by enemy fire rate. 2 divided by enemy fire rate. There we go. And we're going to incorporate that there. Perfect. All right. And at that point, we're going to save. And that is actually going to be the end of section 2.